Hello everyone. The bracelet is in my dresser drawer, now hidden under a mess of old scarves and forgotten mementos. I find myself looking at it occasionally, even though I've buried it deep enough that I shouldn't, because it feels like a secret heartbeat pulsing faintly in the corner of my life. But that's not where the story starts. I was the type of girl who grew up thinking that if I didn't chase joy, it wouldn't come looking for me. Our small apartment smelled of mildew and compromise, a place where laughter briefly echoed before. I learned to find comfort in small things, pages of a journal eye full of daydreams, the solace of music and a pair of cheap headphones, and that love was a fragile thing that is unpredictable and frequently fleeting, but even so, a part of me still yearned for it when I met Daniel in my final year of university. Being swallowed by my parents' constant arguments, my father leaving when I was 11, and my mother being left to pick up the pieces with the exhausted determination of someone already defeated, life became a lesson in endurance. After graduation, we were married in a simple ceremony, and my mother sobbed as I walked down the aisle, whispering a silent prayer for my happiness. Daniel was steady like a well-built house in a storm, thoughtful, methodical, and endlessly patient. He spoke of plans and futures with a certainty that wrapped around me like a warm blanket. It was as if fate had finally decided to be kind. He wasn't the kind of man who swept you off your feet, had spoken in an emotional voice, and I trusted her, thinking that I was entering a life that would protect me from the chaos of my early years. At first, it seemed like I had found everything I was looking for. Daniel was a school teacher who was meticulous in his work and committed to his students. I got a job at a nonprofit, where I spent my days organizing community programs and my evenings talking with Daniel about life over cups of tea. For a while, that was enough, but eventually the picture started to take shape. I tried to fill the void with work, throwing myself into projects that left me exhausted but unfulfilled. The cracks were subtle at first, where silence lingered between us for too long, and laughter didn't come as easily. Daniel's steadiness, which had once been comforting, started to feel like a weight. He thrived on routine, his days carefully compartmentalized into lessons, plans, and tasks, and our conversations dwindled in favor of his late nights at the dining table surrounded by papers and red pens. I remember the day clearly, the sharp click of his shoes on the tile floor, and the way he filled the room with an energy that seemed to hum in the air. He had been hired as a consultant to revamp our outreach strategies, a task that required him to work closely with my team. Eventually, I felt this kind of quiet rhythm, but deep down I felt a gnawing emptiness, a longing for something I couldn't name. It was during one of those long gray stretches when Liam entered my life. At first, I kept my distance from Liam because I was wary of his confidence and the ease with which he seemed to navigate the world, but it was impossible to avoid being drawn to him. At first, our interactions were professional, with brief exchanges and meetings, jokes over coffee breaks, and a spark that I tried to ignore. He had a way of commanding attention without demanding it due to his sharp wit and easy charm. I would laugh it off, brushing aside the slight flush that rose to my cheeks, thinking it was harmless, just the kind of banter that happens when you work closely with someone. However, his words continued to replay in my mind long after our conversations ended, and it wasn't until much later that I realized how carefully he had been drawing me in. He would say, tapping his temple, "Don't keep them to yourself," when I remained silent during the discussion. Colleagues Liam and I collaborated on projects and shared ideas in meetings with the kind of efficiency you'd expect from two people who are passionate about their work. He had an unmistakable ability to cut through the clutter and get right to the heart of an issue, and I respected that. When our team successfully completed a particularly challenging fundraiser, I was even thankful to have him on board, but over time, something changed so subtly that I didn't notice it at first. That change was rooted in spreadsheets and outreach. Plans began to veer into personal territory, but it wasn't intentional. It was just a casual remark about a book he was reading and a joke about his terrible cooking attempts, which I found myself returning without thinking. I shared bits of my life that I didn't often share with others, and he seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say, not in the polite, required way that people occasionally ask questions, but with a curiosity that felt disarming. One day, over coffee in the His tone was informal, but there was a weight in his eyes that suggested he truly wanted to know. I hesitated, taken aback by the question's intimacy, but I finally said, "Growing up, I saw how hard my mom worked just to keep us afloat. She always said the only thing that got her through was the kindness of strangers. I wanted to be that kind stranger for someone else." He nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips that's really beautiful. "Most people don't have that kind." His words caught me off guard and caused me to blush. I quickly steered the conversation back to work, but as I lay in bed with Daniel later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said. The days turned into weeks, and Liam and I started spending more time together. At first, it was only work-related, with late nights spent in the office finishing proposals and brainstorming sessions that went longer than expected, but eventually, our interactions permeated other parts of the day. He had a way of making me laugh that felt natural, like the kind of laughter that comes from deep in your chest and leaves you breathless. I hadn't laughed like that in years, not with Daniel, and not with anyone. One afternoon, after a particularly taxing meeting, Liam caught me in the hallway as I was making my way back to my desk. "You look like you could use a break," he said. We began eating lunch together, sharing a table in the packed break room, and we exchanged stories about everything from our favorite movies to the most embarrassing moments of our lives. Leaning casually against the wall, he said, "You work too hard. When's the last time you did something just for fun?" I hesitated, the question taking me by surprise. Fun felt foreign, like a relic from a past life. "I don't know. It's been a while." I took it with a smile, the tension in my shoulders slightly easing. I guess his brow furrowed slightly, as if my answer. When I sat across from Daniel at the dinner table later that evening, I found myself thinking about how long it had been since we'd done something spontaneous just for the joy of it. I tried to remember the last time we'd laughed together, and came up empty. That upset me, but I pushed it aside because my life was fine. "You should change that," he said simply, in a tone more serious than I expected. "Life's too short not to enjoy it." The office was a tomb of silence by the time the last of our coworkers filtered out their laughter and idle chatter, and the low hum of the heater replaced it. I told myself that Liam had a way of stirring something in me that I couldn't quite name. It wasn't just his charm or his quick wit, though those certainly didn't hurt. It was the way he saw me as if I were someone worth noticing, worth listening to. He made me feel alive, and that feeling was both intoxicating and terrifying. As the minutes passed, the silence between us grew heavier and charged with something unsaid. He moved closer, his presence magnetic without being overwhelming, and for reasons I couldn't quite explain, I didn't step away. "You're always the last one out," he said, his voice cutting through the silence, and he was smiling that I stayed behind to clean up the scattered notes and stray pens that littered the table. However, the truth was harder to admit. Liam was still there, going through documents with an effortless focus, and I didn't want to leave. I noticed that he said a teasing lilt to his tone, but then his expression softened and his voice dropped just a little. "You don't have to hold everything together all the time, you know." The words hit a nerve, hitting deeper than they had any right to. "What are you so afraid will go wrong if you leave things a little messy?" I muttered, huffing out a small laugh that was more nervous than amused. "I suppose I like having control over things." My hand trembled a little as I reached for a file, and I cursed myself for the reaction Liam saw. Of course he saw, he always does. "Hey," he said softly, and as he moved to stand next to me, his shoulder touched mine just enough to make me realize how close he was. "Okay, yeah," I said too quickly, and a nervous laugh escaped before I could stop it. "It's just been a long day," he agreed, but his eyes lingered on me. "You work too hard. You know you should let someone take care of yourself for a change." I should have left, said something to break the spell and bring things back to the safety of professionalism, but instead I remained where I was, my breath catching as he reached out to hand me a folder, and when our fingers touched, the jolt sent through me was sharp and unexpected. The words were innocent on the surface, but the way he said them, the way his voice dipped just a little, and the way his eyes held mine was anything but casual. For a moment, neither of us moved, as if the world had stopped holding its breath to see what we would do. Then, slowly and deliberately, Liam leaned in, his lips meeting mine softly, at first tentative and searching, as though he was giving me every chance to pull away, but I couldn't. I looked up, startled, and realized just how close he was. His face was inches from mine, and his expression was unreadable but undeniably intense. In the silence of the empty office, I found myself leaning into him, my eyes fluttering shut as the kiss deepened ever so slightly. It wasn't passionate or urgent. Rather, it was slow and deliberate, and a connection seemed to blossom between us. His subtle cologne, mixed with something earthy and warm, washed over me, and for a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to forget everything else. The day's routine, the years of routine, the promises I had made, until reality set in. "I know," Liam said. His voice was steady, but laced with something I couldn't quite identify. Regret, maybe? Or resolve. His words should have been a relief, but the way he looked at me, as though he wasn't entirely convinced either of us believed what we were saying, made my stomach turn. I grabbed my bag and muttered a quick goodbye as I all but fled the scene. Suddenly, my breath came in short, uneven gasps. This can't happen. When I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me like a shock, but it didn't stop the storm raging inside of me. By the time I got to my car, my hands were still shaking, and I gripped the steering wheel tightly while I stared at the dark office building in the rearview mirror. My mind was racing with ideas, none of which made sense, and they were all focused on Liam and the kiss that had made me feel like it was a mistake. I told myself that it was a mistake, a lapse in judgment caused by proximity and exhaustion, and that it wouldn't happen again. The morning after the kiss was a strange blur, and I woke up to the familiar sounds of Daniel moving around the house, the clink of his coffee mug against the counter, the soft creak of his desk chair as he prepared for another day of painstakingly planned lessons. But as I sat there in the silence, the ghost of his kiss still lingering on my lips, I couldn't ignore the truth clawing its way to the surface for the first time in years. That scared me more than anything else. I had promised myself that the kiss with Liam would be a brief error, a moment of weakness I would bury deep and never revisit. But as I prepared for work, my thoughts betrayed me, replaying the scene in excruciating detail, the warmth of his breath, the gentleness of his touch. I shook my head, trying to focus, but the memory clung to me like a stubborn shadow. When I got to the office, I prepared myself for what I knew would happen because I wasn't naive enough to believe Liam. He wasn't the type to let things go, but I wasn't ready for the boldness of his next move. He showed up in my office doorway just before lunch with a small, neatly wrapped box in his hand. He said, "Morning," in a casual tone, as if we were just co-workers exchanging pleasantries. I froze, my fingers hovering over my keyboard, and I replied, trying to sound unaffected, but my heart was already racing. Liam entered, shutting the door behind him with a jolt of ease. He put the box on my desk, his fingers lightly grazing the polished surface. "I saw this and thought of you." I stared at the box, the silver paper catching the light in a way that made it seem both innocent and dangerous. "What is this?" I asked, sounding quieter than I meant to, and then I opened it and saw that he smiled disarmingly. I hesitated, telling him that I couldn't accept whatever was inside, but my curiosity betrayed me, and I slowly peeled back the paper, my breath catching. "I thought it suited you," Liam said, leaning slightly against the edge of my desk, light-free, "something you should be." The implication in his words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I looked up at him, my pulse quickening, and I said, "I can't take this," as I discovered a delicate bracelet nestled inside a tiny feather-shaped charm that hung from the silver chain. Its design is simple yet striking, and it's beautiful. My voice trembled. "It's too much," and he tilted his head slightly. His expression was soft but unwavering. "It's just a bracelet," he replied, but his eyes retained the same intensity from the previous night's silent challenge, which caused me to waver in my resolve. When I reached out to return it, his fingers touched mine for an excessive amount of time. The touch sent a shockwave through me, as if he were trying to convey something that words couldn't. I should have insisted, I told him to go, but instead I relaxed my hold and allowed the chain to tug in my hand. I could feel his eyes on me as I put the bracelet back in its box, but I didn't close the lid. "I meant it to Liam," I said at last, though my voice lacked conviction. Whatever this is, it has to stop. He straightened his smile, and his tone changed to one of seriousness. Does it? He asked in a quiet but direct tone, because I don't think your husband sees you the way you deserve to be seen, and I don't think he appreciates you. You don't know him, I said defensively, but my voice was already losing strength. I know enough, Liam said, his gaze steady. I know he underestimates you, and I know you've forgotten what it's like to be noticed, really noticed. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy blanket. You're wrong, I whispered, but my voice was trembling. Am I? He asked, his eyes searching mine. With that, that's all I'm asking. He turned and departed, leaving the little box on my desk like a ticking time bomb. I stared at it for what seemed like hours, caught between the guilt tearing at my chest and the flicker of something else that I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. Eventually, I put the bracelet in my bag, telling myself it meant nothing, but as the day went on, I couldn't stop thinking about how delicate and full of possibilities it had felt in my hand, and I couldn't stop thinking about Liam. The break room was a haven. The coffee machine's hum filled the air as I poured the steaming liquid into a mug, the warmth seeping into my fingers. That day, I had wandered in for a quick coffee, hoping the caffeine would carry me through the rest of the afternoon. Liam entered a moment later, his presence as effortless as ever. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded in acknowledgement as he grabbed a cup for himself. The room was quiet save for the occasional clink of ceramic. However, he broke the silence by saying, "If caffeine were a crime, you'd be on your third strike by now." I turned to face him, startled, and noticed the tiniest hint of mischief in his eyes. "Very funny," I replied, rolling my eyes, but I couldn't help but smile. "I'm serious." He continued to lean casually against the counter. "I've never seen anyone drink as much coffee as you do. It's impressive, really almost heroic." I laughed. He smiled as he raised his mug in a mock salute, and I could feel his gaze lingering, his smile softening into something more earnest. It was disarming the way he could shift the air between us with nothing more than a look, and I cleared my throat. He laughed, the kind of laugh that bubbled up before I could stop it, full and genuine in a way that surprised even me. "If this nonprofit thing doesn't work out, maybe I'll start a side hustle as a caffeine influencer. You'd be a natural." I turned toward the door with my mug in hand, suddenly aware of how close we were. Before I could move, I felt his hand on mine. It wasn't firm or forceful, but it was enough to stop me in my tracks. His touch was warm and steady, and when I turned back to face him, the air seemed to thicken around us. He said, "Wait," in a low, almost hesitant voice. I looked up at him, my heart thumping so loudly that I was certain he could hear it. That made my breath catch, and before I could think or stop him, he closed the distance between us. His lips met mine with a boldness that sent a shockwave through me. It wasn't tentative like the first time, nor was it a question awaiting an answer, but rather a deliberate and confident assertion, as though he were claiming something he'd already decided was his. His hand moved to my cheek, his thumb lightly brushing my skin, and I felt myself leaning into him, my resolve crumbling under the pressure of the moment for a moment. The rational part of me cried out to stop, but the part of me that had been craving something to break the monotony wouldn't let go. Then, with a force I didn't know I had, I pulled back, my breath coming in shallow bursts. "This has to stop," I said, my voice shaking even though I could hardly meet his gaze. "This is wrong." He stepped back, his hand dropping to his side, but the smirk that tugged at the corners of his lips told me he didn't believe me if you say so. He said it lightly, but there was a hint of sarcasm in his voice that made me unsteady, so I quickly turned away and left the break room, my heart still racing, the coffee in my hand forgotten and getting cold as I walked back to my desk. I kept telling myself that I had meant what I said, that whatever this was couldn't go on, but the ugly, undeniable truth was that I didn't believe myself. The cafe Liam chose wasn't one of the busy chain spots near the office, but a small tucked-away place on a quiet street. It was the kind of place where the face felt private, like a secret shared between old friends. The air was filled with the rich aroma of coffee, the clink of cups on saucers, and the soft hum of conversation. Liam had mentioned some of the event details while leaning casually against the edge of my desk. His tone was breezy, and his expression was laid back. I told myself that this was just a professional gesture, so why did my heart skip a beat when I agreed? When we got there, Liam ordered my favorite drink without thinking and slid it across the table to me with a knowing smile. He teased me lightly, his eyes sparkling with laughter, and I tried not to notice the flutter in my chest. His simple gesture made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Or you're just observant," I countered, trying to keep my tone light. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, catching the motes of dust that danced slowly in the air. Liam had a way of telling stories that drew you in. His words were vivid and full of life, and I found myself laughing harder than I had in weeks. He leaned closer across the table, as if the outside world had faded into the background, and at one point he told a story about a hiking trip that ended with him and a friend. We talked about work, but the conversation never went there. Instead, we effortlessly strayed into topics that felt both light and deeply personal. I laughed so hard that my sides hurt, and for a brief moment I forgot about the knot of guilt that had taken up residence in my chest since the kiss in the break room with Liam. We were stranded on a trail during a rainstorm, and we thought we would be eaten by bears. He said, shaking his head dramatically. It turns out the scariest thing was realizing we had no cell service to call for help. As the afternoon wore on and the light outside turned golden, we left the cafe, and Liam led me to my car. The silence between us was no longer awkward, but rather comfortable and even charged. As we got there, his hand touched mine, sending a familiar shiver through me. I looked up at him, gasping as his gaze lingered on mine for a moment. I thought he was going to kiss me again, which both excited and scared me, but instead he smiled with a small knowing curve of his lips and said, "See you tomorrow." When I got into my car and drove away, the taste of the coffee he had ordered was still on my tongue. I knew this wasn't over, but I wasn't sure it ever could be. The third kiss came on a night that felt inevitable, even though I had spent weeks convincing myself otherwise. The office was quiet again, with the faint tick of the heater and the hum of the heater. If that's what it was, it left me more uneasy than the kiss itself. Liam was at my side, leaning over my shoulder to point at something on the screen. His voice was calm and steady, but the closeness of him made my skin buzz. I could feel the warmth of him, the faint scent of his cologne mingling with the sterile smell of office supplies, and my heart was a drum beat in my ears, drowning out reason. The clock was the only sound as we worked late into the evening, finishing a proposal. This type of task required focus, but left plenty of opportunity for the tension between us to increase. This kiss wasn't hesitant or uncertain. It was deliberate, charged with all the things we hadn't said, all the lines we'd already crossed, and time seemed to suspend itself, the rest of the world falling away until there was nothing left but the two of us. Without thinking, I turned to him, and the movement brought us face to face so close I could see the flecks of gold in his eyes. Neither of us spoke, nor did we move to step away, and the silence stretched before I could remember all the reasons why I shouldn't. I covered my face with my hands as the enormity of what had just happened crashed over me. This was the last time I muttered more to myself than to him, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. The quiet chaos of the kiss was electric and consuming, and for those few stolen seconds, I allowed myself to forget everything else. However, even as I was speaking, I knew it was a lie because of the look in his eyes. He leaned against my desk on Friday night and suggested we grab a drink. I hesitated, but I didn't say no. "Just a drink," he said, his grin disarming. "You'll need it after this week." I told myself it was harmless, a simple way to unwind after days that had stretched too long, and Liam had a way of making me feel better. His eyes and the unspoken promise between us told me this wasn't over. It couldn't be, and it wasn't the week. He picked a bar that was far from my usual spots, trendy and full of energy. I agreed because it was a place I wouldn't have picked on myself. The music pulsed through the air, the low bass reverberating beneath my feet, and the lights were dim, their glow catching on the gleaming surfaces of the bar and tables. It was intoxicating in its own way, a stark contrast to the predictable rhythms of my life. When we arrived, I felt out of place but also oddly excited. I thought it would be fun to have more people join us, but Liam smiled and motioned for me to slide into the booth next to him. I felt both relieved and disappointed because, although some part of me didn't want to admit it, I had hoped for the intimacy. I realized we weren't alone because two more coworkers, Emily and Marcus, were already seated at a booth. Their drinks had finished, and their faces were lit with easy smiles. Of just the two of us, I forced a smile as I sat down. Emily was already halfway through a story about her botched attempt at parallel parking, and her animated gestures made Marcus and Liam laugh. I joined in the laughter, but my eyes kept going to Liam, who was next to me. His presence was magnetic, and as he moved in his seat, his shoulder touched mine occasionally. Every unintentional touch sent a spark of awareness through me, though I tried hard to hide it as the drinks flowed. The conversations became more casual, and I found myself unwinding more than I had in months. Emily's contagious energy and Marcus's razor-sharp wit kept the table ablaze with laughter, but Liam held the majority of my attention. He had a way of telling me stories that were vivid, and occasionally his humor would be sharp. At one point, Marcus ordered a round of shots, his insistence loud enough to draw amused looks from nearby tables. I hesitated, but Emily raised her glass in celebration, and Liam slid a shot toward me with a playful grin. He said, "Come on, one won't K** jello." I laughed and shook my head as I lifted the glass, demonstrating peer pressure at its best. I teased Liam to survive the week, and he said, raising his own glass. Our eyes met briefly before we clinked glasses and downed the shots. The alcohol burn was sharp, but it left a warmth in its wake, easing the last of my concerns as the night went on. The booth felt smaller, the distance between Liam and me getting smaller with each. As the minute went by, his arm was resting on the back of the seat, his fingers lightly grazing my shoulder as he spoke. It was subtle enough to be written off as an accident, but it wasn't totally so. At one point, Emily excused herself to dance, dragging a reluctant Marcus with her. I watched them go into the crowd, the music drowning out their laughter as they headed to the dance floor. They'll be gone for a while, Liam said in a low voice. His words were intended only for me, and I turned to him, my heart pounding as I heard the lights above us dimmed further as the music changed to a slower, sultry beat, and the booth felt impossibly small. The noise of the bar faded into the background as Liam's gaze held mine, and my heart raced with a mixture of excitement and fear. They're having fun, I said, my voice steady despite the knot of anticipation tightening in my chest. So are we? He asked, leaning closer. I swallowed hard, unable to form a response, but he was right. Of course I had needed this, to feel something beyond the monotony that had consumed my life. The way he looked at me, and the way his words wrapped around me made it clear he wasn't just talking about a night out when the others finally returned, breathless and laughing. You look like you needed this, he said softly, his voice barely audible over the music to let go for a while. The rest of the night was a blur of conversation and laughter, but underneath it all, that unsaid tension remained simmering just beneath the surface. The noise of the bar faded into a kind of hum in the background, a low rumble. It felt like a lifeline as Emily collapsed into her seat, fanning herself dramatically, never letting Marcus lead on the dance floor, and gave him a mock glare. I laughed with them, grateful for the distraction, though I couldn't shake the lingering heat of Liam's gaze. I could not tell from their expressions whether they were judging, curious, or just amused, but I was vaguely aware of Emily and Marcus continuing to talk, their voices lilting with amusement as they watched me and Liam. All I knew was that the air between Liam and me seemed to spark, drawing me toward him in a way I couldn't resist when he leaned in, his intent evident in the way he paused waiting for me to pull away, and I didn't breathe until his lips met mine. The rest of the world vanished for a split second. It wasn't just a kiss. It was the crossing of an invisible line that I had been avoiding for weeks. The rush of the moment sent my mind reeling. It was reckless, yes, irresponsible, but it was also intoxicating, like stepping outside of myself and letting go of everything I had been carrying. Liam pulled back his expression, rendering it unreadable, and a sharp rush of excitement swept through me before everything changed. Marcus was closer than before, and his voice was playful as he said something I couldn't fully comprehend before I could react. His arm was around me, drawing me into a new orbit, and his voice grew softer as his words faded into a blur as his face and lips approached. At first, I froze, my mind racing to process what was happening, but my hesitation was short-lived because the alcohol I had consumed earlier and the evening's electric detachment combined to create a heady mixture that deemed my instinct to stop him out of guilt. I barely had time to process what I had allowed before Emily joined us. Her hand brushing mine as she leaned closer was unexpected. Her movements were soft, almost hesitant, but she didn't stop. Her lips briefly touched mine tentatively, and my mind spiraled further into disbelief. I didn't resist, not with Liam, not with Marcus, and not with Emily. That would have normally surged to the surface felt distant, unreachable, drowned by the noise in my mind. Even before I stepped out into the cool night air, Liam walked with me to my car, his hand brushing mine as he murmured a soft goodnight, but whatever had felt exhilarating earlier curdled into something else. The bar's noise turned to nothing but static, and the bright lights overhead blurred as if the room itself was tilting. I wasn't sure who I was in those moments, only that I wasn't myself. The night passed in fragments of laughter that sounded hollow glances that felt too. The person who had entered that bar earlier tonight wasn't the same person who stood there. She was someone I hardly recognized, someone reckless and self-centered. Daniel was already asleep when I got home, and his breathing was steady and rhythmic as he lay curled on his side of the bed, completely unaware of the storm I had walked through. I stood in the doorway for a long time watching him, the weight of my actions finally crashing over me. It wasn't just guilt, though. It was something deeper, a profound unease that went through my chest like ice. The following morning was even worse. I sat across from Daniel at the breakfast table, my coffee unbroken as he read the paper, my routine unbroken. He looked so calm, so completely unaware of the emotional wreckage swirling inside me. The silence between us felt unbearable, every unspoken word settling in the air between us like lead. I put myself in bed without making a sound, my body heavy with exhaustion, but my mind racing too fast to let me sleep. The kisses were not impulsive or careless. Rather, they were moments when I let go of everything I believed in, let go of the life I had worked so hard to build, and sank deeper into a void I had been pretending didn't exist. The guilt weighed heavily on my chest, but it wasn't enough to erase the truth. I wasn't just running from the life I had with Daniel, I was running for myself. It became a secret folded away, hidden so deep it would never touch our lives, but the memory of what had happened clung to me impossible to shake. And I felt more empty the farther I ran.